In this presentation, we are going to be discussing the books of Ezekiel and Daniel. Okay, Ezekiel the prophet was a contemporary of Jeremiah and was a prophet of the exile, which took place between 597 and 538 BCE. Ezekiel was taken into exile around 597, about the age of 25, and we see that both in the prophecy of Ezekiel in 32:21 and also in 2 Kings chapter 24. Ezekiel was called to prophecy around the age of 30, and this particular prophecy gives us a lot of dates, so we are actually able to calculate pretty well exactly what time these things were happening in Ezekiel's life and in the historical period of that time. His ministry lasted about 23 years, from 593 to 597 before the Common Era. He was also married until his wife died, and even the death of his wife served as a sign to the people, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. The genre of Ezekiel is prophecy, not surprising, as Ezekiel finds its place among the other major prophets alongside both Isaiah and Jeremiah. What's different, though, here is that Ezekiel introduces a kind of a new phase of prophecy in comparison to the prophecies prior to this point. And it's very different in form and in characteristics from the previous prophecies, particularly in its use of very strange visions and actions, which we'll be talking about a little bit later as well. The purpose of this particular prophecy is to encourage the exiles, as they have been captured by the Babylonians and taken into captivity in Babylon. And what is important for them to understand is while they are undergoing God's judgment, they're also needing to understand and to know that God is not confined to the temple in Jerusalem, but God is still with the people there in Babylon, and that God will restore them in the future, that this is not a permanent state, and that God has not abandoned them, has not left them, but there is hope of restoration in the future. Okay, let's look at the outline of Ezekiel's prophecy. It divides itself pretty easily into three parts, and the first half, or I should say the first two parts, are very much focused on judgment, both on Israel and on the Gentile nations as well. And then the last section is actually focused on the restoration of Israel, and so that's where we kind of get into that future hope and what God still has in spite of the judgment that they are currently undergoing. There is hope and restoration that is promised to Israel in the future. Continuing with our outline here, we're going to elaborate just a little bit more on some of the details of these three divisions or sections of Ezekiel's prophecy. And the first section, the judgment on Israel, as we said earlier, is covered in the first 24 chapters of the prophecy. And it starts out with the prophet's call. And even here, we actually see that this is a very kind of unusual or different way that Ezekiel is called to be a prophet. He encounters a vision of God, and this is where he actually gets the revelation and understands that God is actually present there with the people, even though they're in exile in Babylon. That God is not limited to just residing in the temple in Jerusalem, that God is there with them, with the people. It then quickly moves into the issues related to why Israel has been judged, and addresses the problem of idolatry among the people. Also, there's a section in chapters 12 through 19 that we see a lot of visions and warnings of judgment, and then parables and allegories of judgment as well. These are also unique characteristics that we see in Ezekiel's prophecy that's somewhat different than prophecies up to this point. And then, continuing with the judgment theme on the Gentile nations, chapters 25 through 32 address the issues against, or the judgment against, the nation of Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, and Egypt, to name a few. Okay, in this section, this final section, the third division of Ezekiel's prophecy, found in chapters 33 through 48, here we see finally the actual messages and visions that God is giving the people through the prophecy of Ezekiel, to actually show them that there is hope, there is going to be restoration, and in spite of how bad things look, that they will be restored. And we see here the true shepherd in chapters 33 to 34. And here God has judged the leadership up to this point. They have failed to provide the people with the leadership that God required. And so here we're seeing that God is going to be their true shepherd, that God will actually lead them in the future. There's also the idea that they will be restored to the land, that they are going to return. They will not be stuck in captivity forever. They will be allowed to return back to the land, and there will be restoration there. Also, the people will be restored. At this point, they pretty much see themselves as a nation that has died, almost abandoned by God, and have no hope. And so there's this famous vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, which is really just depicting that God is going to actually bring back to life what may be considered to be or seen to be as just completely dead and beyond any hope or restoration whatsoever. And so in chapters 37 through 39, we see that the people themselves are going to be restored, brought back to life, so to speak, and a life with God. And then we also see the restoration of the temple in chapters 40 to 43, along with the establishment or reestablishment of all of the cult worship practices at the temple. And then finally, there is a vision or a picture of this great holy place, and there's the river of life and a holy city and the holy land, which wrap up the prophecy in chapters 47 and 48. One of the unique features that we find in Ezekiel's prophecy are allegories, stories, in other words, that represent, while they tell a particular story, the characters or the people or the creatures in those stories actually represent something else in reality. The first one that we see is an allegory of the vine, and the vine here represents fruitless Jerusalem. In other words, this vine that should be producing fruit has become entirely useless, good only to be just burnt up in the fire. The next one is Yahweh's wife, and here Yahweh's wife is actually depicted as unfaithful Jerusalem. And then the allegory of the eagles, and the eagles actually represent the powerful rulers of Babylon and Egypt. In the allegory of the lioness, and actually these next two, the lioness and the vineyard, are both actually laments, which is to actually mourn over the loss of something. In the allegory of the lioness, there's the lament of the cubs that have been lost, that the lioness has raised to be strong warriors, but they are both captured and not able to escape. And these are the cubs represent Israel's princes, and the lament over the loss of what they once had and no longer have, now that they've been captured as part of their judgment. And then the sword is representative of God's judgment, and using Babylon. Actually, the sword is Babylon is the sword that God uses in order to judge the people. And then we have two adulterous sisters that represent actually Israel and Judah, basically the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, both of which have conducted themselves as adulterous wives, and when they had God as their providing husband. And so here we see these two adulterous sisters representing both nations of Israel and Judah. And then the last one is the cauldron, which is used to actually burn out the impurities of something, often metals or whatever it is that you're cooking in this pot. And the idea is that you cook it hot enough that it burns out all of the impurities. But of in spite of how hot the cauldron would get, these impurities that were part of, or that are practiced by the people, would not be purified, that there was no cleansing them. Another interesting or unique feature that we find in Ezekiel is that God calls him to do some very strange things. And he actually acts a lot of these things out, as opposed to just speaking or giving a message or even telling a story or an allegory. And many of these, if you notice, all of are focused on the judgment of Israel. And so you see that the first one begins in chapter 4 and goes all the way through chapter 24. And if you recall, those are the chapters in which are focused on the judgment against Israel. And so one of them that we see here first is that Ezekiel is called to create a map, draw a map of Jerusalem on a brick, and then to lay siege to it, to indicate that Jerusalem is going to fall and is going to be sieged. And then also he is asked to lay on his left side for 390 days and then on his right side for 40 days. This is again part of this whole picture of Jerusalem being taken and then eating the rations of the exiles. And so he's called upon to prepare the food of an exile and portion it out and ration it out and eat very small portions. And this is all kind of part of this same picturing of what's going to happen to Jerusalem. And then in chapter 5, we see that he's asked to shave his head, including his beard, and he divides up the hair into these little small sections, and then the wind blows the vast majority of it away to indicate how small the remnant will be of those who will actually survive this. And then we see another depiction of the siege of Jerusalem in chapter 21. And then last we have the death of Ezekiel's wife, which tragically is also another one of those pictures of what is happening and the judgment that's coming upon the people of Jerusalem, and that Ezekiel is not to mourn the death of his wife in the traditional fashion, but rather is to show that even the people, as Jerusalem is destroyed, are not able to mourn the loss of the city. Okay, here we'll begin our discussion on the book of Daniel. We'll begin our discussion with genre, and there's some very interesting and kind of controversial issues related to genre. And part of the issue that we have here with the book of Daniel is that we're trying to determine whether or not this is actually prophecy or whether it's more of a narrative of what happened with Daniel during the time of the exile. And the book of Daniel is not included in the prophetic literature in the original Hebrew Jewish canon. The Hebrews actually included the Hebrew scriptures actually have Daniel among the writings rather than among the prophets. And so you find Daniel actually in there along with Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther and also like the book of Psalms, etc. And so, but when the Greek-speaking Jews created the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, they actually placed Daniel among the prophets instead, right after Ezekiel. And because the early church was more inclined to use the Septuagint, the Greek translation, over the Hebrew, because that was more the common language, Daniel as a prophecy became sort of the tradition in both the early church and even the modern church. far as date and purpose, the most recent research actually reveals more about the origin and purpose of Daniel, and the question as to whether or not it was written earlier during the 6th century or later during the 2nd century before the Common Era. Most scholarship, modern scholarship now, would be more inclined to go with the late date, and this is based on historical information that's related to the dates and the people that we find discussed in the book of Daniel. So the purpose, though, for Daniel is to provide hope and encouragement to God's people when they were under threat. And this actually fits very well with the 2nd century dating, because it would be not unlikely that the people during this time period, during the Maccabean time period, would actually be feeling that threat, and that they would find that message of Daniel to be something that would be an encouragement to the people. There are some interesting literary features that we see in Daniel that is uncommon in some of the other writings or prophecies that we read in the Old Testament. One of them is the use of language, and so Daniel actually begins in the very beginning, starts out written in the Hebrew language, but then switches over to Aramaic, and then switches back again to Hebrew. And no one has ever really come up with a really good explanation. There are a lot of different theories that have been proposed, but there's no real solid explanation as to why the switch back and forth in the language from the Hebrew to the Aramaic and then back to Hebrew. The other thing that's interesting about the book of Daniel is that part of it is written in the 3rd person, where the other part is written in the 1st person. And the stories, so the beginning part of Daniel, we see the stories of he and his friends, and those stories are written as a narrative in the 3rd person, where the second part of Daniel, which are more the visions that he has, are written in the 1st person with Daniel as the speaker. Okay, so here let's take a look at the outline, or sort of the formatting of the book of Daniel. And we find that it actually divides up into 2 distinct sections. And the first section, section 1, begins in chapter 1 and goes through 628. And this section actually deals with all the different stories and experiences that Daniel and his friends have during their time of captivity. The second section is from chapter 7 through chapter 12. And here we see Daniel's 4 visions. So let's look at a little bit more detail of section 1 here, the section about the stories about Daniel and his friends in chapters 1 through 6. Okay, so the first story we have is the faith of Daniel and his friends as they actually determine that they're not going to eat the king's food, but rather to eat vegetables, and how that actually plays out very well for them. The second one is we see that Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. And in chapter 3 is the story that if you went to Sunday school, you definitely heard this one. Daniel's friends in the fiery furnace. And then Daniel's prophesies Nebuchadnezzar's madness or insanity in chapter 4. And then Belshazzar's feast in chapter 5. And then the most famous story of the book of Daniel is Daniel and the lion's den in chapter 6. Section 2, we see that Daniel's 4 visions here, and the first one in chapter 7 is the vision of the 4 beasts, and then we have the vision of the ram and the he-goat, the vision of the 70 weeks, and the vision revealed by the angel. Last, we'll look at the theological significance of the book of Daniel. And here we want to just kind of focus on whether or not Daniel was written in the 6th century or the 2nd century. It does not change the importance or the significance of the message. And here we see that in the book of Daniel, we see that God is sovereign over history. God is in control of history, even when the circumstances seem to indicate otherwise. Also, that God will not allow the forces of evil to continue unpunished, but God will establish a righteous reign. And with those two things in mind, then the people should be able to persevere in faith, knowing that God is in control, regardless of the circumstances.